Now, one important way that psychologists and therapists will try to determine a diagnosis is through using psychological tests. And these tests can broadly get separated into two major classes. You have the projective tests and then the objective tests. So the projective tests can include things like the Rorschach, or you might know it as the ink blot test. Another one is a thematic apperception test, the TAT, or the sentence completion test. I'll walk you through these a little bit in the next slide. And then the second group is the objective tests. There's actually far more objective tests than there are projective tests. And they can include ones like the MMPI, which is, it stands for Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory version 2. So it's MMPI 2. There's also the Beck Depression Inventory. And again, there's hundreds of other ones, far more than we can cover. But the first grouping, the projective tests, what you do here is you present the person with some sort of ambiguous stimuli. So here you have an ink blot. So this is from the Rorschach. And for the Rorschach, you actually ask them, what might this be? And the person shares what comes to mind to them when looking at the images. So they share what they might see in the images. And the thoughts, images, and ideas are thought to constitute projections. Projections are this idea that sometimes if you have something ambiguous, what the person sees in that thing represents not something that is true about the object, but actually something that represents something going on inside of them. And so some of these aren't really all that meaningful. So if a person says, I see a butterfly versus a bird, it doesn't matter that much. But if they have certain responses, they can be more meaningful. So if they have violent or sexual, or if they perceive movement or colors when there are no colors, all of those are really potentially very informative to the interpretive process. They might reveal hidden motives and personality characteristics. Now, the advantage of projective tests is that the person can rarely figure out exactly what you're trying to do. So there isn't like a real clear-cut right answer or wrong answer. Again, there can actually be multiple different right answers that, again, are all healthy. And so these are harder to fake. If you take a objective test and if you have some common sense, you can know when things are pretty obviously indicative of problems or suffering or disorder. And so again, projective tests have a lot of use actually in situations like forensic work. So when you're working with people getting evaluated for insanity defense or competency to stand trial, projective tests are often used. If you have child custody tests, sometimes this is helpful because, again, it's harder to fake. And so, again, they're not widely used, but they're still readily used, and there is research evidence that they provide some insight about the person. And so, even though these may sound kind of bizarre or unusual, there's research showing that they do reveal something about the person. Okay, so again, this is a Rorschach. Another more simpler version is you can provide people with incomplete sentences and ask them to complete. So some of these are, my dad is, I feel, when I'm sad, and things like that. So you ask the person to complete the sentence, and often, again, that can be very informative because they give, they project things inside of them onto their response, and it can help you understand them better. Now, Less interesting perhaps, but also very widely used are objective tests. So these are typically self-report rating scales. They can be yes, no, or Likert based from 1 to 7. And the advantages are objective tests tend to be more accurate for diagnosis than projective tests. So in general, they're more accurate, they're more useful. And compared to projective tests, they're often, well, they're less expensive and quicker. A Rorschach can often cost upwards to about $1,000 to $2,000 because you have to pay for the psychologist's time to administer it with the person, which often takes about an hour to an hour and a half, and then you have to pay them to interpret the findings. And the interpretation can take several hours because they very thoroughly go through the responses and score them. And so it can be very expensive. These objective tests, some of them have validity scales that help you to identify when a person might be faking good or faking bad. And so there are some questions on it that we know in general, if a person's being honest, they'll say, yeah, sometimes I feel that way. So questions, sometimes it's about morality. Like if I had the opportunity, I would sneak into a movie theater. We know that, in general, actually most people would say yes to that. And so there's a sense that people who say no to that might be faking good. They might be trying to portray themselves really more favorably. So the disadvantages are, though, it's possible to look better. Again, oftentimes people can figure this out, and if it doesn't have a validity scale, you can make yourself look better. And I also find sometimes they set a formal tone for therapy. There's a sense of structure and just it makes it feel more rigid as opposed to therapy where you're just getting to know them and getting to know them personally. And so this, I think, is why a lot of therapists don't use objective tests, is because they want to make sure the person feels like there's a personal connection. All right, on there.